All right, I'm going to open up the room, and then as soon as this sort of hold screen comes down, that means that everyone's filed in and we're ready to start.
Thank you again, Natalie. Silly.
No, it's my luck to be here alongside you, so I really appreciate it.
You have good light. Welcome to the Skirball Tapes. Our conversations with people of radical imagination and indelible acts. And I'm thrilled today to welcome Natalie Diaz. I'm honored that she's here. And if we're lucky, we may also be visited by her dog, Federico, named after the great Spanish poet that Natalie alludes to quite often in her own poetry. And I understand that Federico is a desert dog. So if Federico wants to come, Federico is very welcome. We're going to talk, Natalie and I, for about 45 minutes. Then your questions. Now, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll take them up to the chat. And we're going to go 10 minutes past 12, if that's all right with you, Natalie, and with Federico. We're going to go to 10 minutes past 12. There is so much to say. First, I want to thank Natalie again for being here. And I also want to acknowledge that just a few weeks ago, she lost in an accident the youngest member of her large family, her youngest brother, Mino, leaving his family. And thank you for, you sent out a beautiful tribute to him. And thank you for letting us share your grief for the loss of this extraordinary, sounds like extraordinary man. Now, Natalie, I wished that we'd had an hour for each of your poems because they are so deep and they're so pulsating with energy and linguistic daring. But I also wanted to give our audience a sense of the magnitude of your work because you're a poet of such formidable strength and delicacy, a poet of such pulsating energy and piercing focus at the same time, an activist, an educator, and I hope, with your permission, towards the end, we'll talk about your poems about water and your work about water. You have a complex identity, and you're right about that. You were born in Needles, California. Could we just show a visual of Needles, California? And I want you to tell me if this is ironic or not. So, George, could we see? Natalie, that is surely an image of settler culture, is it not?
Yeah, definitely. The wagon. I mean, it's the first thing you see coming into town. And even, Route 66 was kind of an opening up of being able to drive through this area. And, it's funny because, you grow up in ways and you grow up with the language that you have to identify yourself or to call yourself or name yourself, right? And you are often what the people who love you call you. And so I grew up with this wagon in my town, passing by it, I never thought much of it. It was a wagon. They didn't teach us much about our own tribe in our school, much less other natives. It was very generic. It was almost as if natives only lived kind of on the East Coast and a long time ago. So, it took a while for me to make sense of that wagon. It's almost when I began to hear other people's language about who I was or what I was, that I, even the fact that I didn't know that I was Native American, I was Mojave. I grew up on my reservation, around my people who were my relatives. My neighbors were my relatives. even the ones who weren't my relatives were still in my community, could still, get after me or still, correct me. Yeah, so I think it's in some ways, like, the irony is even deeper as you get older and realize who you are in this country's imagination. Its early imaginations, I think, of who I was, of who natives were, was the bigger shock to me than even, its current imaginations of us, but that it could imagine us as a being who deserved the violences and punishments that they delivered on us. But yeah, that wagon is something that, it's something I don't like looking at now, but it's a point of pride in our community. And I think, as most symbols are, people don't really understand where they've come from. They just know,
Yes.
Where they are situated in them. So,
But one of the many extraordinary things about your first book of poetry is how you write with both love and controlled anger about growing up. First on the reservation, then in the move to town. And you're also, Natalie, you're wickedly ironic. And one of the poems I'd like you to talk about a little is your poem about the last Mojave Indian Barbie. Now, this is the summer Barbie. This poem was written in what, 2010? There's so many poems I could have pointed to, but this, it is, as I say, wickedly ironic. Tell us how you came to write the last Mojave Indian Barbie.
I didn't grow up with Barbies. My older sister had a Barbie, but I was very focused on rocks and basketball in my desert. I thought I was going to be an archaeologist when I grew up. So I would always collect rocks and fossils, and I would find them in the backyard, but I didn't realize that the people who had lived in the home before me were anthropologists. And so they are the ones who had scattered these fossils around the backyard, but I thought I was very, very much discovering something. But I had friends who had Barbies. So when I would go to their homes, like, I would do my best to play with the Barbies. And so Barbie had kind of I had an interesting relationship with Barbies generally. But when I was in college, my teammates found somehow a native Barbie, and they bought it for me as a joke. I was in graduate school, so I was in my MFA program, and it was so generic. Like, it was a native Barbie. I must still have it somewhere in a box somewhere, but it was funny. And then, it's like, always beneath humor, I think there's some sort of pain.
Yeah,
and so I laughed along with them, and it was funny, and we joked about it. And then the more I thought about it, about not just that it was a native Barbie, but that it was such a blanket, generalized body that they thought they were replicating, or that they wanted to replicate as, I don't know, a sign of diversity, which most likely was more about marketing. It's like, oh, let's see if we can sell this. So, of course, it became probably a collector's edition. But yeah, so I just, it kind of like burned in me like a little ember that wouldn't quite die down. And so it was just on my mind, and I started like making small jokes in my head about it, or thinking, well, like, what would a real native Barbie be, or Mojave Barbie be? Yeah, and so for me, it was kind of a way, like most things are, I think, a way of like troubling or talking back or asking a question about things that are normalized. There's so many problems with the Barbie in general, whether it's a white Barbie or not, but much less that it was a native Barbie, and that it was something that my friends who are not native got for me as like a funny gift.
Well, your description of Barbie and the information packet that comes with her is every cliche imaginable.
Yeah.
About Native women. But doesn't your Barbie escape at the end? She has sex with Ken.
Yeah.
doesn't she? And then if you can describe Barbie's escape from the dream world.
Yeah, I mean, she rocks Ken pretty much. He's got some of her beads in his hand by the time she leaves, and the family is aghast. I even brought in the grandma Barbie,
Yeah.
which I don't even know if they had. I'm sure they had. I mean, it was so fun researching because I realized how many accessories Barbie had and how inaccessible and unknown most of those accessories are to my community or to even me growing up. But I mean, the fact that Barbie had scuba gear, was pretty incredible. And so a lot of that is like very much historically accurate in terms of what was available to Barbie, the dream house, even the meals that they put on the plate. But yeah, so at the end, she gets back into her res car, and manages to fire it up, and on her last, like one of her last acts of defiance, she kicks over their Cocker Spaniel, the little plastic Cocker Spaniel, because they had little pets that came with them, but she kicks it over on her way out. And yeah, and then, I didn't know Joy Harjo at the time, but I had been introduced to her work because I came very late to Native writing because it just wasn't something that I was exposed to. I didn't grow up with poetry. I didn't, the poetry we had was very much British poetry in high school. And then, it wasn't until college that I, even then it was mostly anthologized. And so it wasn't until grad school when my professors turned me toward Native poetry. So I began to read Joy Harjo, Simon Ortiz. But yeah, so there's a tape that's of course stuck in her tape deck in her car because we always had a tape stuck in there. So you were just forced to listen to it. And it was often like a tape, heavy metal tape my brother had left when he was cruising with his friends. So we were all stuck listening to it. But yeah, there's a Joy Harjo tape, stuck as she drives off through the gates. And of course the gates clang shut, as she drives out. So it was, a moment when I could let her have a, not just like triumph, but I think more importantly, and this is something that feels important to me, is like, it's less about the triumph and more about like triumph against anyway, but more about what we do beyond having to always fight back against or press back against. So for me, that was like a more of a move toward freeness and, from that, because I think so often, and, even like when I engage the stereotype, I tried very hard, especially in that first book, to really hang on to them and press against them. But something I was looking for was that moment that moved beyond that. So,
but the first book, there are poems of defiance in it, a dance poem, for example. But there's also, along with your wicked humor, which is defiant, but there's also poems about the pain. And one of the metaphors that I notice is the metaphor of amputation, physical pain. And could you talk about that metaphor? Because it's the women without legs who are still talking, but what did that metaphor of the missing legs or the amputated legs mean?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this in like pieces before, and it's something I'm trying to write about now. But I think I first learned love and desire in a non-sexual way through my great grandmother's body. You can hear me all right, right?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, sorry, another window popped up on my screen. But I was very close to my great grandmother. Her name was Lona. One of my Mojave names is a name like toward her. And she was a very strong woman, but I only ever knew her from her bed. So by the time my first memories of her began, she already was a double amputee. And, you know, diabetes is it's such an epidemic on our reservations. And she was an IHS or CHR, so Indian Health Service or contract health services. She was their contract health and record. She was a nurse for them. And so she, you know, even like her tending other people and trying to take care of them, it still didn't stop her from becoming severely diabetic. And you know, I used to help take care of her. So, you know, I was very close to her, and, you know, she had very large hands. I remember, like, beautiful, beautiful hands. And, you know, I didn't realize it at the time, but she would always like hold my hand when we talked and squeeze it and press it. And I didn't know at the time, but that's very much like an old Mojave way of touch. It's called kabanam. Wasn't until I did my language work that we kind of recovered that word, and therefore its practice. But I would lay in her bed with her because she had this like hospital bed, because we all lived on the res. They lived kitty corner to us. So like to get to her house, I would go out and there was a hole between her fence and ours, and I would just cross over and go through the backyard. And like my aunt, who was kind of her caretaker, my great aunt, would come out and holler until we came out the back door. They'd holler my name, and I would come out and go over. But I helped with kind of everything. Like, you know, I cleaned for them. I did all their errands. And importantly, like I would also help with her insulin. And I think that was something, because I remember being so nervous about it when I was, you know, in hindsight now, because back then it was simply like an injection. They didn't have a lot of the technology they had. But I remember being so paranoid about the bubble, you know, not getting a bubble in. And I remember like the little tiny vials, and I would stack them normally where eggs would go. But you know, because I would go in and pick up the prescription and I would bring it home. And so I would put them in the refrigerator, and I remember stacking them and always getting in trouble because I was always trying to make like a little pyramid, and they're like, lay them flat. But, you know, all of the ways like I learned to touch her, to bathe her, there was such a tenderness there. And because I loved her so much, like I didn't realize at the time how broken her body was. It was simply this woman I loved. And so I feel like there's something about that was very important to me, is that I learned love before I learned that you should or should not love what's broken. And so it feels very private still, and it feels very powerful and very native versus, you know, I think as you grow up, you definitely learn the confines or the template of whatever love means in our society, which shifts from community to community. But our overall kind of American society is very punitive about love, right? It's very, yeah, it's very concerned with the power dynamics of love. And so I feel very grateful for that. But it's also why those images, I think in particular, the thighs. So even though when I'm talking about, you know, how to love a woman with no legs, I'm very much imagining my grandmother, my great grandmother. It's also, I think, very much why the thighs and the hips are so prominent in my work throughout, you know. And it's been a criticism at times, like early on in my writing, when
a criticism.
Well, they're like, you're saying hips too much, and I was like, you know, and luckily for me, I'm like, if you think I'm saying it too much, it simply means I haven't said it enough. You know, I'm all about, I think excess is the ecstatic in some ways, and so I'm not afraid of excess. But yeah, so I think it shaped me in many ways. One, in the way I practice love and touch in my life, in my everyday, in my hour, in my relationships with my family or with lovers or friends, or, you know, even I think strangers, you know. But yeah, it was a very much a shaping for me that feels so essential to the way I'm able to be in the world, because I think if I had just shown up and learned love from my country, I don't think I would have had much of a chance of knowing that we deserve love and that we're also capable of it. And so, yeah, it was a very formative experience for me. And she meant the world to me. She bought me my first pair of basketball shoes, which she was on such a fixed income. And so I know it wasn't easy for her, but, you know, and that it pops up in the poem a little bit where she's like asking me to run back and forth, which was, you know, true. She sent me with my great aunt. And so we paid some of their bills and picked up her prescription. And then they took me to this little store that had the Chuck Taylor All-Star shoes, the little canvas ones. And I had big feet and long, skinny legs. So I looked, you know, I looked a little bit silly. I have some old photos, but because, you know, my little scrawny legs and these big giant white, of course I picked the white ones, white Chuck Taylors. But I brought them home and she, you know, I had them in the box and I was so proud because I'd never had my own pair of basketball shoes, and she bought them specifically for that. Like, you know, because I would travel, they would take me to tournaments all over the reservations and visit their friends, and they were very proud of me because I would go play on their friends' granddaughters' teams. And yeah,
You're in your beautiful white Chuck Taylors.
Yeah, and I brought him home and she had me run back and forth, and she was hollering and run. And I mean, the room was this little HUD housing kind of template bedroom. So it wasn't very big. And, you know, I was like shuffling and doing all these things. And I completely believed it, you know, like she was cheering me on. It was so important to me.
I'm so glad you talked about this because of the way in which love runs through the poems. And also you say you're a linguist. You're also an etymologist, an archaeologist, a botanist. There's a great specificity in your poetry. So the hands are there, the hips are there, the throat is there. One is always in a specific world, it seems to be, in your poetry. But is this the same great grandmother that, in I think one of your most marvelous poems, Snake Light, who talks to you about your name?
Yes, that's her. And I
And
think it was like a snake family. And, you know, snakes are very powerful to a lot of cultures, and in some ways even taboo to some cultures because of that power. But for my family, it's a power that you can kind of lean into, that also teaches you a responsibility. And to me, I feel like the way that I learned about snakes and what they mean, and the way I learned about the way you think about things or people is very similar, and the power of that is very similar to the way I approach language. You know, I think language is a power, a physical power. Ophelia Cepeda, the Tohono O'odham poet, who's based down in the Tucson area, incredible poet, incredible person, and also linguist. You know, she has a very simple quote: "Language is power," but she means it as a physical power as well. You know, that you could speak and summon the rain, you know, or that you could speak and heal, or that you could sing and carry someone who's passing on. You could carry them to the next place. And so,
yeah, under the influence of this woman who loved you and whom you loved, didn't you begin to see that the snake, because there's a line where you say, "I am a snake." Didn't you begin to associate your name, Natalie, with the sign of the snake?
yeah, especially etymologically, like thinking about how, I mean, I love the fact that the letters we use now, right? We tend not to think of letters, and even in linguistics, right? You're thinking more of like phonemes and sounds, but the letters are literally, they're from bodies. They're from physical beings, physical objects. You know, the A being Aleph, being the ox, then becoming the ox head, and then shifting and becoming the letter A for us, or B, Beth, like the house. You know, whether it's a fish or an eye, like they were all physical things, and that feels very important to me. And so as I was looking at, you know, letters and the S and the snake and how it's shaped, and also, like, you know, we have so many snakes in my desert, and Yeah. So I think it's something that the power, like the real physical power and the real active, actionable power in language, in letters, and I think in particular in writing, feels very important to me. You know, like I try to tell my students, like, you're making a mark. You're not just writing a word, but you're making a mark.
Yes.
Like, what a lucky thing to be able to do in like this kind of vast world of making or remaking or reorganizing energy to create a new shape of it.
Listen, but one of in your poems about the greatest pain, sometimes you will say, all right, but here's the ink as well.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. Ink also built from bodies, right? Bones, and I mean, it's
Yeah.
ash, like having is it's not it's still the energy of the object, just reorganized. You know, I'm kind of fascinated by that, by this kind of quick way of saying, like, like a dead body is still the body, just
Yeah.
reorganized, and so that energy is still present, just in a different way, and
Right.
unfortunately, ways that we don't find as legible to connect to, and so we feel the losses of that.
I think that in your poem, Snake Light, the snake skin is still energetic and beautiful. Snake, you see, I have to ask you about in your first book, When My Brother Was an Aztec. There's such pain in that as well. And the brother was a meth addict. And I think, is it fair to say that your poems about him are both a eulogy and an elegy, or is that being too fancy?
No, yeah, I mean, I think it's I feel like I'm constantly learning about grief and what it means, and again, like I think something I'm really interested in, and why I think our native languages, our mother tongues, are the languages that came up from the lands we're from, are so important. So English arrived at this land, and in some ways it's bringing a whole different set of values here. And one of the things it doesn't quite value is life. And so English doesn't have a lot of ways to carry and express even death, much less grief. And so I feel like, poetry gave me a way to kind of not just to say, this is wrong, I'm telling you a story that hurts me, or I'm retelling it, but a way to be able to look at my brother who is an addict, to be able to still look at him, right? Because there comes a point when things are so wrong or so bad that you're just supposed to move them out of the way, or like write it off, or he's a lost cause. But he's my brother, I love him, even if that love is one of the most difficult loves I've known. And poetry gave me a similar language, I think, that basketball gave me, which was about the possibility of my body. Poetry gave me a language that's about maybe the capacity of what I'm able to carry. And so I'm very interested in, like, the idea of the elegy, or how do we let the elegy be something that's still happening and still becoming, because I very much need that language in order to continue loving my brother. And
Well,
it's quite perfect. Yeah. And so I'm just like interested in like those griefs and like what that means.
But you carry historical grief in your body, in your poems about carrying those griefs. But I can't resist doing a little bit more with basketball. I'm a huge fan too. And Natalie, I warned you there might be something about basketball. So there you are with this family. You're showing this loving, huge family in colonized America. And then you go to Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, carrying your Chuck Lawrence sneakers, I imagine.
Still has
and
bigger.
And can we please have the slide and tell me, you marvelous, marvelous poet, tell me, is this you?
Yeah, that's me.
That is, well, Old Dominion was a championship team, wasn't it?
Yeah, we were good. We were number one in the country a few years in a row. We lost to Tennessee in the championship in the finals. Yeah, I mean it was a pretty incredible experience.
But then you became a professional player too, as well. And some of your poems are set in Europe, where I'm imagining you were playing, and in Asia.
Yeah, I was able to, I mean, it kind of showed me the world. And yeah, I mean, I was there for 5 years traveling, and I loved basketball. It was another language for me, maybe one of my first languages, my first lexicons, I think. It's taught me how to like to dream in a way, because basketball is very much future game. It's not what's happening right now, but what might happen next. You have to be prepared for, or being able to see what might open, or what is yet to happen. And so, yeah, I think it was just so, and then it showed me the world, but it also is very much the way I learned. I mean, I grew up in a 2-bedroom house, with 12 plus people in it at any given time. And so, yeah, I mean, it's the way I see the world. It's in a very kind of like, I think, a generous way, in terms of everything's moving at the same time. It's about spacing, about what could happen, kind of about moving on from what has happened. Yeah, and so that it's the way I think. Even like, I think better with people, talking with people. Even though I know everyone says writing's quite solitary, I'm always in conversation, either with someone I'm reading, or always looking for a conversation about what people are thinking, about the ways they see the world. So yeah, it's very much become like a structure of how I engage, all of my relationships.
Uh, you were a point guard, right?
A 1-2, yeah. I didn't have a 3-point shot. That was my problem. So
Okay, but you're right. I write like I played basketball: fast when you can be fast, and slow and be a kind of resistance when you need to hold and wait for the next opening, the next space to happen. But I love your basketball poems. And it seems
that
to
makes
me,
me happy.
it seems to me in your basketball poems, there is that dream at the end. And I'm thinking of something like top 10 reasons why Indians are good at basketball, where it ends when it goes to the net. You're filled with dreams of how 1492 could have been different. By the way, I read that poem to my spouse, and she loved it, and she loved the rhythm of it.
Oh,
Not a basketball player, but quick
yeah.
player.
Sometimes I stop after number one, and that will be the end of it.
No, it shouldn't, all 10. But the last section of the first book, I think, is where it shows you as the queer poet of such richness and daring. And before we go to what seems to be some of the great, huge poems, magnitude poems in the second book, I was wondering that the ecstasy has pain, as well as a seeking of the oblivion of ecstasy. But there's another recurrent metaphor, I thought, of shoulder blades. Now you're on the big hands and the hip, but the shoulder blades, I get, but blades are knives as well. And are you breaking a binary between pleasure and pain? I mean, as a queer, you're breaking binary, thank you, because you break the binaries with such panache and energy. But that metaphor, shoulder blades.
Yeah, I mean, one, I think it's very generous for you to like open up. I mean, I'm excited to think about this, and I'm thinking about, I mean, because blade, I'm very engaged in etymology, and
Yes, yeah.
part of that is just because, like, with Mojave, I'm always forced to kind of leap from one etymology to the next, and so like it also helps me realize like how small the English we use is and where it has come from and how it has shifted or how big it was, especially when I have Mojave on this side, which is I think it's a much more generous language, but blade also meant like leaf or bloom, right?
Mhm.
Like, and I think about that. I think about, over the pandemic, my partner was like gardening, and I remember like so we went back to the reservation, and my partner at the time had like built a garden there, and I remember how difficult it was to grow something, especially because there was like a lot of clay back there, and I mean this was like this used to be river, like kind of lagoon at one time where we are, but when they channeled the river, that it all dried up. But like watching these small buds break through the ground, and the violence of that, right? Like to know that must hurt in a way, right? Like to the amount of energy and the expense of growing, of budding, of becoming. I think, and that's also why I'm attached very much to the Lorca line, verde que te quiero verde, because I actually, when it's verdes ramas, like I actually think it's very much about pain. It's not just green, how I love you green. It's about something maybe inexplicable beyond words, because it's so deep into life,
Yes.
and life before our body, which I think is hard to wrap our head around. That I think in some ways we're a very controlled type of life, or we try to be, which maybe to our detriment. But yeah, so I think about that a lot, and I think the blade for me, the word in general, but also, I think there's a line from another poem. It's like a knife making love to a wound.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think a lot about that, about where the ecstatic happens, and that the ecstatic is not without pain, is maybe through pain, and the pain of any kind of disruption, right? Or the pain of anything that requires you to be at stake, or to put yourself at stake, where your emotions, your feelings, like you're open and vulnerable to something that might or might not happen. So I think about that a lot. And and shoulders, again, kind of like thinking of hands, the body, the shoulder blades feel very important to me.
We want to do something in very quick succession, if it's okay with you. I want to show first, George, if you would, the epigraph for your first book. And George, if we could go back and show, because you work in Mojave, you work in Spanish, you work in English. And I had Diana Taylor translate this epigraph. There's no misfortune that lasts 100 years, nor body that could withstand it. And it seems to me there is the doubleness. There is the doubleness. But also, George, could we show the covers of the two books? Because
brother Mino here, who we lost recently.
that is Mino. I didn't realize.
Yeah, he posed for it for me. He was he was a really great guy. So we got him to do this, which was wonderful, and I'm really lucky for the memory of it, and I'm glad you showed it here.
But also in your tribute to him, you talk about what a fun lover he was.
Oh yeah, full of it, meaning life and bull and all the other things. So
and then there is post-colonial love poem. And George, if you could show the contrast, the next slide, the contrast. You took the photographs for this, right?
Yeah, I was alone in my house for a weekend, and so I spent time playing with some cameras.
Natalie, are we to try to interpret these covers, or are these just playing with cameras? Because there's one eye covered, one eye open, and then the back of the head. So you're looking forward, but we can only see the cover person for the back. And then post-colonialists is ironic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I believe it, right? I mean, we look at our world today and definitely not post. I was asked to respond to there was an anniversary for Edward Curtis.
Right. Yeah.
So, because he has some Mojave photos.
He was the photographer of the West, of white
Yeah.
men.
And he, he would mix up everybody's regalia. He would pose people in ways they wouldn't normally pose. But like one of the things I was really interested in with these photos and why they're the blurred the way they are is I was very interested in like how not to be captured by the camera. And so I was trying only to make whatever the quote artifact was. So the beads, for example, are one of the few things in focus on both of the photos. And so that was part of what I was playing with, of like, if I could hide from the camera, or if I could even do something that didn't feel as passive as hiding, but that could be just a resistance to being held still.
Oh.
And I think a lot about this, a word that's really important to me is being unpinnable, and so I think about that as like a way of to be unpinnable is also to still be becoming, to have the possibility of becoming whatever's next. And so that was part of why the photo there. And then with both of the photos, I think something I realized early on is that I wanted, in the first book, I wanted whatever body was on the cover, because I was getting like Graciela Iturbide photos, which are beautiful, but not who I was writing about and talking about. And then I realized like the photos we had were not also who I was talking about, because they were taken in a way to kind of deny whatever Mojaveness is. And so it was important that my brother was willing to do that, and my friend's husband was a photographer, and they were visiting. They, that we were able to make that happen, because I wanted to show who it was I was trying to hold and love in the book, who was at stake. And then in Post-Colonial Love Poem, I very much I feel like I took a leap toward whatever is post-colonial and what is love, and I felt like I needed to put myself at stake first. I needed to, if I was going to be able to write these things, I needed to acknowledge that, I'm at stake primarily in writing these. And so that was one of the reasons why I used those photos. And I'm really lucky that Jeff Schatz, he knew of the project I did. I did it for a group in Seattle, and it had some lectures around these photos I took. And when it was time to do the cover, Jeff wrote me and asked if, he's like, I'm wondering if you'd be interested in using those photos, or if we could, kind of show you some options with that, which was, again, lucky. And just, I'm always lucky. I have so many good teams that I'm a part of. So I'm able to be a lot more than I would be if I was just alone. So,
but you are, as I began, you're very generous in how you describe the people you've worked with. It's so many, you give us so much. You give us so much. But it did seem in Post-Colonial Love Poem that the possibilities of love become greater between the first poem and the last poem. It's the possibility of love. The Minotaur becomes perhaps gentler or more believing in love. But also, there are, in the second book, these extraordinary poems about water. And I just tell everybody listening to us, some of them are quite sardonic and funny, but they're small epics, these major poems about water. And water now becomes a passion of your activism. Water becomes a source of grief, and water is the source of life. Do I have this right? We are water. And if we dry up the rivers, we die of ourselves, of a thirst that we have created. Do I have this right, Natalie? Have I read you at all correctly?
Yeah, I mean, and it's literally our body.
Yeah.
You know, our world is water first and foremost, you know, and I mean, even thinking like cosmologically. And I think also like, I mean, so having a relationship with the land and waters I'm of, you know, I look out my window, I see Creation Mountain. I look south, downriver, I see where Mojaves go in the next life. And I have that alongside Catholicism, which is my father and his family and history's religion. And you know, the way that I believe, which I feels like a real gift when I look around the world and when I see what's happening, is that like our human self is so much smaller compared to the larger realm of life and living. And I was taught that we learn to live from these first and very natural living, life-giving bodies, you know, such as the river. Like, what other way would anybody ever want to be loved other than how the river moves, how it can overwhelm, how it can wet, how it can carry, how it can rush, how it can slow, you know, how deep it can get, how it can jump the bank when it needs to, how, yes, we can channel it, but at some point the river will return to what it knows, to what it remembers, to what it's holding. And, you know, I think that's a really lucky gift that my family and my people have given me. And that I, you know, for me, the river is not separate from myself. And I, you know, I know that's hard when we deal in metaphors, and when metaphor is, you know, a great vehicle of poetry and language. And, but I feel like for me, that's a really important distinction between the way I was raised and maybe the way others were. And it's something that I think we don't have to be so far from, right? Because I do really think some of this is just about knowing we have a connection with the place we're in, or learning how to connect to the place we're in, learning that, you know, I'm not just in an apartment right now in Fort Greene, but I have a responsibility to the land that I'm on and to the waterways that are happening. I have a responsibility to know, you know, and it just so easy, right? Our society makes it so easy for us just to slip by and to not think about these things, that because everything is property at this point. Even water, I mean, you know, there are very few rivers that have free or open water in them. Almost every acre foot of water is already bought by somebody. It already belongs to somebody, which is a, you know, unfathomable in the ways that I was raised.
So you work with water now. You were collecting stories of the elders about water. Is this, or
yeah,
what the elders can teach us about the water that gives us life in his life?
Well, and I mean, I'm like, what do you have is there a body of water that you feel like is a body of water, you know, or feel connected to?
I grew up in the Pacific Northwest.
So there it is, right?
Yes, there it is.
Yeah. And I mean, that, I think water, our lands, like they shape the way we imagine, they shape the way we dream. They kind of shape all of the relationships we come into, and our ability to navigate those, you know. Like the desert, for example, it's the light in the desert. Like you can't really lie about a lot of things. You can't hide a lot in the desert, you know. And you also learn to be sensual. Like you read the clouds from hours and miles away, or suddenly you're like, I feel water in the air. I think it's going to rain even before the sky changes, you know. So you learn to be a body among other large bodies. And I think that relationality is so important. And so, you know, some of the work I'm doing now, I had the luck of being a part of Jackie Woodson's oral history project with the Emerson Collective through Baldwin Center for the Arts, which just allowed me like to work with elders in different places, because I lost my teacher, Hubert McCord, Mahakiev is his Mojave name. But I lost him last September. And that's who I had been learning from, and, was my best friend in so many ways. And, speaker, singer. But I learned a lot of the way I think about water from him as well. And I've had this luck of being able to like connect with people down on the US-Mexico border, the Pascuayaqui tribe, folks in Jamaica, the Miguel sisters who are here, Spider Woman Theater, but they're part Rappahannock, and then their father's from a tribe in Panama. Again, both water tribes. My tribes are both water tribes. The Acamel Atam are named for the river there, Ankh Acamel, which we call the Salt River or Rio Salado. And then Hamakav is named for the Colorado River. And then I go to, I was in Brazil, and then I go to Oslo and Stockholm and Malmö next week, and I'll be meeting with some Sampi.
It's a beautiful project.
Yeah, and you realize like our stories they're not the same, but the importance of water is what's central to it, and the ways we've learned from it. Which is, again, it's just a travesty that our country doesn't respect water. I mean, we don't respect a lot of life in general, but the way that we're destroying water and at the rate at which we're destroying it it's amazing to think that you don't. It's like, how do we imagine ourselves next or in the future?
And again, to our audience, read the water poems, including one about an imagination of the Museum of Water in the future, after we have destroyed it. Natalie, one very quick question, and then I see questions and questions. Can I ask you a very quick question? And then could I ask you, if you have the book, to read the dedication to post-colonial love poems? You have a dedication. If you don't have it in front of me, I can do it, but I can't do it as well as you. The dedication comes at the end of the book, opening the dedication up to the future. Would you like me to read it? Because it really is wonderful if you don't have it in front of you. Hello, Natalie.
Right here.
Hello.
So
can I go? Natalie, the question is, you do believe in the imagination?
You hear me? No?
Yes, I hear you now.
Yeah, can you know?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
It says my connection is unstable.
Natalie, you believe in the imagination, the powers of the imagination?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the energy of living, I think, is imagining your next breath, even though, our body is already doing it for us. I think I definitely believe in like the dream and where we're arriving next.
You have your poem in front of you?
The dedication?
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you like me to read it?
I would love it if you would read it, because there's so much in it.
And I like the word toward, because I think it kind of helps me orient always. So, and like away from myself and toward the collective. So, dedication toward the missing and murdered Indigenous and Native women, girls, trans women, non-binary, and two-spirit people in our families, communities, and across the Americas and other occupied lands, in thinking of the touch and tenderness you deserve. Toward my mother, who generously imagined and taught me a way of love along which I and my beloveds can be the most possible. Toward our many bodies of flesh, language, land, and water. Toward all we have been born for and carry and have yet to become of love.
Natalie, thank you. Joy Harjo writes that you have to sing of a country that's gone. That's incorrect. And I thank you for being an extraordinary singer. I thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn to the questions, and it's a tribute to you. Here they come. Here's a long one about rivers, water, flow, and the sound of flowing. I think rivers and moving water shapes itself, the environment, and us through friction. Do you think it is friction between water and what passes through that creates our tracks, our future?
Yeah, I mean, I believe in tension. I think tension and friction are not bad things. I think they're natural. I think sometimes we try to think of agreement always, or sameness or oneness. And I mean, what are, and think of people and
I think this is technology, not Natalie. Natalie, I'm sorry.
you know, of life and how it. Oh, is it? Am I breaking up again?
Yes, but it's all right.
I mean, isn't Fort Greene? Isn't Fort Greene supposed to be bougie and have good internet?
A second, and maybe from Christina or Anne. Thank you. And I think because the connection is unstable, and because the words Anne, thank you, express, I think, for all of us, I want to apologize if we could not get to your question, to the audience, but I have no apologies whatsoever for having so badly wanted to have the chance to have the conversation with Natalie Diaz. Again, who is, somebody else has written, gracias for being alongside this morning.
Yeah, that was for me, so I appreciate it.
Well, Natalie, thank you again. And what a pleasure, despite our tech troubles. You're an extraordinary gift to many cultures.
Yeah,
You're extraordinary gifts to many people.
Gracias a ti and your team. And hopefully we can have you over for dinner. We can have dinner and talk a bit more. So
that would be wonderful. That would be absolutely wonderful. And I hope we could read one of the Minotaur poems then too.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much.
Or any of the poems. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for being our singer and our prophet.
Thank you. Dream well, everybody. Ciao.